Hi everyone, welcome to today's webinar, Becoming a Family, Together but Not Together. This webinar is part of the Law Awareness Weeks at CDC 2021, a collaboration between Law Society Pro Bono Services, the 5 Community Development Councils, National University of Singapore Faculty of Law, Singapore University of Social Sciences School of Law, Singapore Management University School of Law, and the Singapore Corporate Counsel Association Pro Bono Chapter, supported by the People's Association. I am your host, and my name is Andrew Lee. Now first, some housekeeping matters. Please feel free to ask questions at any time during the webinar using the Q&A function. We will do our best to address your questions during or at the end of the talk. There will be a QR code feature in the slides for you to scan to access the handouts made available for this webinar. A link will also be sent to you in the follow-up email sent to you tomorrow. Please note that the discussion and any material provided in this webinar is not intended to substitute or constitute professional legal advice. You should consult a lawyer if you require specific legal advice. Now, with that, our speakers for today are Ms. June Lim and Mr. Lai Mun Loon. Now, firstly, I'll move to June. Now, June is the Managing Director of Eden Law Corporation, a low bono private law firm committed to providing competent and affordable legal representation to clients of modest means and underprivileged communities throughout Singapore. She has a keen interest in matrimonial matters involving child abductions, relocations, and foreign wives living in and outside of Singapore. June volunteers with LSPBS's Criminal Legal Aid Scheme, the Legal Aid Bureau, and Community Justice Center. Now, as for Mr. Lai Mun Loon. Now, Mun Loon is the sole proprietor of Amicus Consulting. He is a trained and qualified social worker, counselor, and mediator in private practice. Now, prior to starting out on his own, he was the head of professional services at Eagles Mediation and Counseling Center. He has practice experience in Australia and Singapore. Now, Mun Loon also holds a Doctor of Jurisprudence and has finished his pupillage. He is preparing for his bar exams slated for December 2021. Now, thank you, June and Mun Loon, for joining us today. To give our audience a sense of what to expect, I will just outline what we will be discussing in this webinar. Now, firstly, just to begin, we will actually try and understand what a family is actually commonly understood to be. Then we will move on to understand the specific rights and privileges that family members actually possess. Now, these first 2 areas that we're discussing are to actually help our audience have a baseline understanding so that they can better appreciate the issues that we will be discussing in our 3 scenarios. We will end off the webinar by discussing these 3 scenarios that we've created, which will throw up numerous potential issues relating to family. Now, to start off, the question here is, what is a family? Is there actually a legal definition? Is there a correct definition of what a family is? Or is it simply the dictionary definition of a group of 1 or more parents and their children living together as a unit? Now, June, maybe a legal definition?
Well, I think that's a pretty good definition. There are many different kinds of families that we experience nowadays in society. There are nuclear families, there are extended families with grandparents, aunties, uncles. There are also single parent families where the parents are either divorced or they are unwed parents. There are also blended families with step-parents, step-siblings, step-grandparents. And, in certain circumstances, they may have been remarried twice, so then there would be blended families 2 times around. So many different kinds of families nowadays. And I guess the law will have to keep up with these different permutations.
Now, June, you mentioned this thing called a blended family. What exactly is a blended family?
It's a step-parent family, basically. So where one party who was divorced or unwed, that has a child, and then another party has also divorced and unwed and also has children, and then they remarry, and then their children will have to learn to live with each other as step siblings. Potentially, there could also be adoption of each other's children, so that might bring a different dynamic into the mix as well.
Mun Loon, June has shared that, from her perspective, under the law, there are actually many different families. Do you agree? Is there a difference in the concept of family nowadays?
I think the whole idea of family has evolved and is continued to evolve as time moves. Historically, we've seen the traditional families being blood bound, where members of the family will have blood ties or are tied to the family by way of marriage. And today we are looking at it loosening up a bit, where you're also seeing things like she's mentioned earlier, blended families. But traditional family, in that sense, still revolves largely around parents, by which we say father and mother, and then the children living within the same household. And that's where your basic unit of how society functions start to show. So I think that's how we look at families in terms of from a social work point of view.
Now, I understand there is this concept now and some trend where there's something called a family of choice, where the idea of extending a family is beyond blood ties, is becoming more widely accepted. Now, do you actually need to be married to form a family? What's this family of choice, Mun Loon?
A family of choice is where people extend the idea of treating someone like your family member beyond your blood ties, where you see a good friend who has journeyed along with you in life, in school, for example, forming part of your extended support system to a larger community that you choose to be involved in or belong to. We call it the kampong spirit here, something that you see in the 60s and 70s, right? I think there's a slight emergence from it here, but unlike in a kampong where we are geographically located, today it's a lot wider than that. And people who say, I treat like a family, being that of people that you have formed very close relationships with. So that's the complication of human behavior and human nature as well, isn't it? Where the complications are in the blurring of lines and the redefining of roles also come about. Yeah.
Yeah, so there's this family of choice, there are all the different kinds of families. So, June, I'm just wondering, must a person actually be married to form a family then?
Well, I would say no, not really. That you need not be married to form a family. I mean, if a cohabiting or civil partnership relationship is for you and that makes sense to you, then so be it. You just need to understand that if you have these other types of permutations, then there are certain legal implications for your children born out of these different kind of permutations. And then there are also estate planning concerns, which we will explore in this webinar. It's just that whatever it is that is outside of the norm, the law you have to use different legal instruments to cater for that different permutation. It's not that it's a bad group, it's a wrong family or anything like that. It's just different and we cover it in different ways. Yeah.
I see. So, well, on to the next issue then I was wondering about. So if you're saying that, families, to form a family, you don't actually need to be married, then what's so special about this concept of family? I mean, is there any specific rights, privileges that only family members have? Anything so special about this family unit then, Drew?
I guess the legal institution of marriage does still have its place in society. This legal institution of marriage, so a legal wife, it provides certain benefits to these legal wives. So, for example, spousal maintenance, the sharing of matrimonial assets. So you have a concept that assets that are accumulated during a marriage have to be shared if the marriage dissolves. The children that are born out of these legal institutions of marriage are considered to be legitimate, and they are entitled to inheritance through intestacy laws upon death. So even if you don't write a will, the laws do provide for certain percentages to be automatically, so to speak, given to your wife as well, your surviving wife and surviving children. So I would say the legal institution of marriage is the sort of default that the society or law provides for. If you're outside of that, then you would have to provide specially and make sure that those people are taken care of.
Talking about like taking care of people. So for example, like children, if I'm a child of an unmarried couple, do I end up having different rights from those born of a married couple?
Well, in terms of parental responsibilities in caring for children born of unmarried couples, there's really no difference. I mean, your parents are still your biological parents. But in terms of estate planning, then the child born outside of a legal marriage is considered to be illegitimate and will need to be specifically provided for in a will because the intestacy laws will not protect them. I mean, a will is a relatively simple document. I mean, it's easy to do, easy to sign, and so it's not something that is terribly complex. It's just that you would have to separately think about it.
Yeah, okay, so we have to separately think about these considerations. So, Mun Loon, in your own personal experience, having been in social work for some time, have you encountered all these scenarios where people have to think about all these different rights, issues, caring for their children?
Well, I think one of the more complex cases that you get is when say an illegitimate child comes, or a mother comes with her child to the center, and looking for specific help because we can't make ends meet, and the father of the child has passed away, left nothing for the child. They've been cared for by this the deceased father, for example, and there's nothing left for the child if the will wasn't executed in time prior to the demise of the father. So those are not uncommon. You get those cases, you hear about them, you wonder what you could do to help them because there's very little recourse in terms of, and the assistance that you have for them is also very limited. So I think that's where things are changing in the social service landscape. I think there are also discussions about, it's been a lot easier for, like, say, single mothers who are not married, who are raising their children to be able to apply for a flat. But these are slow changes that we are seeing. A lot of advocacy work that's gone on as well. I think that's what I would place. Yeah, but there are cases, like I said, where there's no will and there's really nothing left, and having to ask for assistance from his lawful wife is not possible either. So those are really rare, but you get them as well. Yeah.
How can social services help in such scenarios? You were saying you find it challenging.
So, well, one of the things that we look at is from the family of origin of, say, the mother, right? And we, since you're on the topic of family, right? And when she belongs to a family, she belongs to a family system. We look at it from a systemic point of view and say, hey, what are the resources available for her within her family that can help uplift them, that can help guide them through, provide a stable environment for them. The idea of marriage provides a very stable environment for a man and a woman and socially, where wanting to exit a marriage is not that easy. You then have to see a lawyer, you get help there. You have to wait for, you satisfy the criteria, you have to wait for time. So the stability that a family offers, it's really something that we look at for the family. Now, with a stable system in the family, let's see how we can find the strengths within the family to help support them through the difficult time and uplift them so that when they move forward, right, or they can move forward, they have similar opportunities to others that may be in a different or in a complete family situation. That's what we look at in terms of intervention at our end.
I see. Right. Okay, so maybe let's move on to a scenario. Let's move on to one of our scenarios to try and, well, humanize some of these issues. Let's see our first scenario here. So our first scenario actually concerns an unmarried couple. Ryan and Eva have been together for 10 years. They live in the same condominium unit and have a dog. Whenever they meet anyone, they actually introduce each other as life partners. Unfortunately for Ryan and Eva, they actually had a dispute recently. Eva felt that Ryan was just too friendly with his new subordinate. Now, Eva wants to kick Ryan out of their home. Now, well, June, what issues do you foresee?
I mean, what hits me at the outset is, of course, the ownership of their home or the tenancy of their home. So whether I mean, if they do own the property as co-owners, then of course there must be some way to unwind it. So either Ryan sells the share to Eva, or eventually they have some kind of agreement, and then eventually the house is sold in some way. Or if they rent the home and if the tenancy agreement has both names on it, then she doesn't really have a way to kick him out, so to speak, without having to change the tenancy with their landlord. So, but apart from that, because they are unmarried, there are no real obligations to each other, financial or otherwise. So it's quite a relatively easy relationship to unwind.
Can Eva actually physically kick Ryan out of the home?
Well, I suppose she could. I mean, she could try to change the locks. I mean, I have had cases like that. You change the locks, you take all these things and you throw it out into the corridor and stuff like that. But of course, I would never advocate for this kind of thing. For me, I feel that people should just, even if you are not married, you sit down calmly and you work out your dispute, and then you end in a good way rather than end in a nasty all over the corridor way, right? So yeah. She can do that, but that's the thing about cohabiting or civil partnerships. They are easy to unwind because we don't really have a concept of a civil marriage or civil partnership as in many countries in Europe, for example, where civil partners have rights, right, with over property, or they almost have quite similar rights to a marriage, so to speak, because I suppose those types of relationships are more common and have been very common in Europe for a very long time. So they have a whole body of law that covers those rights. Whereas in Singapore, I think that's not so common, even though I would say it's not uncommon to hear of things like that. So it's easy to unwind because there's no real legal thing that binds them together.
Just out of curiosity, you mentioned that you've had incidents where someone actually literally has the locks changed. Let's say you're the one who's been kicked out. What can you actually do if the locks have been changed?
Well, it depends on whether you are still a co-owner of the place or if you are actually a tenant of the place or not. I mean, if you are an official legal owner of the place, then you would just get a locksmith, cut the lock and go back in. But of course, then you ask yourself, what is the purpose in doing that? That may not be the best way of resolving this dispute, because you go in, you cut the locks, and then you have another fight, right? So it might be a better way to, get a mediator in between the both of you, engage a lawyer to write some legal letters to assert your rights or whatnot, and try and work out the problem rather than re-enter and force, and then you have like the police involved, and it gets very, very messy. So yeah, I mean, that's what I would say.
Mun Loon, what about, have you met any such situations where couples end up fighting like this?
Yes, I think the question I have for couples like that could be, why do you want to go back into the house? Because is the house or the home a safe place for you to return to? So we can cut the locks, and they all know, the policeman will also tell them the same thing. You can cut your name is on the IC, as the address, you can cut the lock, right? But at the same time, the question of physical safety, emotional safety, and the question of emotional safety, psychological safety, that you're in the house and you're always vigilant because you're wondering what's going to be next. If she cannot throw you out of the house, then what would be next that she will want to get rid of you if it's so important for her to have you out of the place. So those are things that I'd be quite concerned about. And then we'll look at other options, to see how we can house them as quickly as possible, to keep them safe and help them rebuild first their own confidence, and then see what we can do with the relationship.
Just out of curiosity, right, June, what about the dog? What if they fight over a dog?
Well, the law considers dogs chattel, or rather possessions of property. Fur kids, we may call them fur kids, but they're not actually children. So I would hardly say that dogs are hardly worth fighting over in court. I mean, there have been cases in the news in the past where people have fought over dogs. But unfortunately, the law only governs children and rights over those things, but not for kids. Yeah.
Okay, June, we've got a very practical legal question here, which is, what if the person who's actually kicked out doesn't even have anywhere else to return to. He doesn't have any alternative to his place of residence that he's just been kicked out of. What can he do?
I think if you are in a civil partnership or a girlfriend-boyfriend kind of relationship like this, you need to be aware of the risk. And the risk is that what will happen if you break up? It's not like you may have property rights over the place. And of course, if you are kicked out of the place and it's not safe for you to return, for example, then you may want to assert your right to sell the place, because obviously one person should not have the benefit of this place over another person as co-owners, like, especially if you pay for the property and things like that. So there are legal ways of going about it. Of course, it will cost you money, it will cost you time, you're probably very anguished over the fact that Eva is still staying in the place. But there is still legal recourse. It's just that I agree with Mun Loon. And you may assert your legal right to cut the lock, but is it really a safe place for you to go back to? Yeah. So I think I would just look at the property rights angle of things.
So let's assume, all right, that thankfully Ryan and Eva had some sensible friends like June and Mun Loon. They actually went for couples counseling, and then they realized that they have to be more understanding of each other. They decide to have a child together, but then remain unmarried. Now, what are your personal thoughts on such a decision?
You're asking me?
Yeah, Mun Loon, just go ahead, go ahead.
Well, I think the starting point as a therapist is to ask them, what does the whole idea of marriage mean to them? Because the not wanting to enter, say, an institution of like marriage, right, has a big meaning question to them. It's like, what does it represent to you, know? And you'll be surprised to learn that many of them will tell you things like, if marriage life will look to be what my parents want to look like, right, then I don't want. So then you want to unwind that a bit, and say, let's hear a bit more about that, to know what's going on. And I'm often reminded that we shouldn't throw the baby out with the bathwater, because much as there's a lot of people who feel trapped in their marriages and they can't get out so easily, right? There's a lot of protection that the whole institution will offer you. So I would ask them, are you more afraid of the wedding or the marriage? What exactly is it? If you could elope with the papers, would you do so? Would that offer you some comfort? So we go back to a safety question for them, and then work from there to hear what really goes on behind it. I will also tell them as a social worker that they should speak with a lawyer quite quickly, because the whole idea because what we are dealing with is not just having children, but also what does the law provide for the children and provide for them in terms of responsibilities, rights, as well as rights and responsibilities over the child. And you don't want to be caught in a situation where you're not even sure about custody. If anything would happen, what will boat to that, So you might want to speak with a lawyer regarding those implications as well.
Right, but okay, let's say in this scenario, right, Eva then learns that she can't conceive, but they still want to actually have a child. They want to adopt. Mun Loon, can they actually do so unmarried?
That's a legal question. Check with June. But I think you can adopt a child unmarried. If I don't recall wrongly, because I don't really do adoption work in the area of social work. But the social emotional part of the conversation with your children is important, because there are single ladies who have adopted children as well. Right, and that works for them. And if they have a partner later, they can explain it. This is I'm married later, and you were adopted and all. But when it comes to a couple where they are already together, how do you explain certain roles? How come one person can adopt and the other person has no rights over? So those are questions that are quite legal in nature, and you might want to run that by June.
Okay,
June,
so you can legally, the law does allow you to legally adopt a child separately from each other as an unmarried person, except that Ryan as a male cannot adopt a female child. So a single male cannot adopt a female child, okay, for obvious reasons. But whether this would be, frankly, the most ideal situation for this child is, of course, arguable. I mean, the MSF, the Ministry of Social and Family Development, department, the adoption department, will investigate the circumstances surrounding the adoption. So you do have child welfare officers who will go and interview, look at your place, interview both parties, interview your friends and family to try and see whether this is an appropriate situation to place an adopted child. And I would say that they would not approve of this adoption if there's no long-term plan to raise the child within the family, especially because, first you will be part of this family and you consider your Ryan, your I don't know what you would even call him. You would call him your stepfather. You wouldn't call him, he's not really your father. He's just your mother's boyfriend, who will then leave. And, if your mom passes away, then who is there anyone to step in the place of Eva? So I think that it's a very confusing situation that the MSF would not be too happy about in this adoption. I think there was also a question about whether adopted children are considered legitimate. Then yes, of course, yes, adopted children are considered legitimate children of that marriage. Typically, people adopt, in my line of work, because I do adoptions, generally there are three kinds of adoptions. Number one are single parent adoptions. They do that as, so when you have a child that out of wedlock, so not married, but you want to restrict the biological father's access, or you want to cut all ties altogether, and you just want to consider that, it's the child and the mom, then you do a single parent adoption to confine the relationship, confine that family to mom, and adopt biological mom and the child completely. So that's a single parent adoption. You have stepchild adoptions, which are by far the most common, when it's a blended family situation, and then you adopt each other's children, and then you form an actual family unit. And of course, in the event of divorce, then the children are considered children of that marriage, and you deal with custody, care and control, and everything following from that as per normal, okay, in a divorce. Then the third type is usually the foster child type adoption. I guess less common, but you do have foster children, and if they have been placed in these families for a long period of time and are considered part of the family, then you may want to consider legally adopting them so that they really are your children. Yeah.
Since we're on this topic of adoption, right? Let's say in a worst case scenario, Ryan and Eva now somehow fell out again. What happens? Will the court apply the same principles to settling custody, care and control for the child of this unmarried couple? Is it the same principle as for married couples? Same kind of considerations?
Can I ask, before you get to that question, since we're on this topic, right?
Yeah.
So what we are saying is that one of the two of them, so either Ryan or Eva has adopted the child, right? And and because only one person can adopt the child.
Correct.
Right, because they're not married, so they cannot have both parties. So the question is, if they split up, is it?
Yes, what if they split up?
Okay.
If they split up, what happens then what happens to this adopted child who is, does he get the same considerations? Does the court apply the same considerations to settling the custody, care, control for this adopted child? Will it be the same as children of regular marriages?
No, it wouldn't even come up, you see. That's what, that was what I was trying to. If, for example, let's take, for example, this child is adopted by Eva, okay, alone, and then she meets this boyfriend, Ryan, and then they live 10 years together. To this child, depending on, of course, at what age this child is introduced to Ryan, of course, psychologically, emotionally, there will be different implications when they do split. But legally speaking, this child is Eva's child. This Ryan is her mother's boyfriend. That's it. No legal rights. So the issue of custody, care and control will not even come up at all. Ryan has no rights over this child.
So it also means to say that Eva can completely cut off Ryan from the child's life, and Ryan has no recourse, right?
Ryan has nothing he can do about it.
Yeah, despite being called daddy for the last 10 years, he actually has no rights over the child, even visiting rights, or access time with the child. Is that true?
Yes. Because to this child, he is no one. Ryan is just mother's boyfriend.
Mm.
Oh, wow. Okay. So let's say Ryan and Eva finally see some sense. They visited Mun Loon, and Mun Loon managed to persuade them that actually, marriage is all right. And they actually get married. But then Eva still has this concern. She feels like I paid for most of this condominium, and she's wondering, but because of certain give and take, they decide, okay, I'll put the condominium in Ryan's name instead. How would Eva actually protect her interests in this condominium, especially since she feels I gave so much money for this, but yet the condominium is totally in Ryan's name?
Well, I mean, if they are married, in cases of divorce, of course, you would look at, it's not just the name, it's not who is the legal owner. That's the protection of the legal institution of marriage that we were talking about earlier. If you are married and you have a divorce, and of course, assets that are accumulated during the marriage are considered matrimonial assets. So even if your name is it's not a joint name property, it's just in Ryan's sole name, for example, that can still be considered a matrimonial asset. You've paid money towards it, and so you should get a share out of it. So we, as lawyers, of course, what we're trained to do is to calculate out what that share should be, and then we would just proceed with the divorce accordingly.
So it won't be the case where Ryan, in the worst case scenario, he just bangs his fist on the table and said, "It's my name, it's my house, you get nothing out of it."
No such thing. I mean, I think a lot of women tend to be quite intimidated by that sometimes. This is also typical in very long marriages where the wife is a housewife, career housewife, married 40 years or something, and all the assets are in the husband's name. So I can understand why some women will be very intimidated by that. But of course, please go and tell, if you have women like that in your life, and your mothers, grandmothers, grandaunties or something like that, then no, they should really not be intimidated by it. Matrimonial assets are matrimonial assets regardless of whose name they are registered in.
Okay. So let's say in the scenario of Ryan and Eva, they're now married, they have an adopted child. Let's say afterwards, they then again decide, okay, they're not suited for each other, they want a divorce. Does the adopted child have any consequences for this adopted child? Because is he in a very confusing situation? Was he considered like any other legitimate child of a marriage?
I think you need to draw the distinction of whether the child is adopted by Eva solely, or the child is it's a stepchild adoption. So it's adopted subsequently. There's like a second adoption, and then it's Ryan and Eva adopting the child. So when the child of both, then we deal with the custody and control accordingly, because this adopted child is the child of the marriage, is considered as if it were a biological child. If it is just Eva's child, then and if they get married, then Ryan is the child's stepfather. We don't even talk about custody and control altogether.
So Ryan doesn't assume the position of a father just because he gets married?
Yes, no. Yeah, you need to do a stepchild adoption to have any rights over this child. Of course, rights come with responsibilities. So you don't just talk about custody and control and all that and split the time. We also talk about maintenance, child maintenance. So if you want to be recognized as this child's father and have time with the child, then you also must pay for the child's expenses.
Let's see.
Unless Ryan and Eva got married first, then adopted the child, I think that would change the situation, wouldn't it?
So because having a single adoption versus a stepchild adoption.
Yeah, because there was a single adoption by both husband and wife within the marriage. So I think that may be a bit different. But emotionally, I would dare say that for the child, if the stepfather whom he or she has looked up to, could be a she, because Eva can only adopt a boy too, right? Okay, so it can be he or she, look up to that guy, right, for so many years and have a relationship. Whether the child is biological, whether the child is an adopted child, whether the child is a stepchild, I think the child's emotions and the child's world will still be quite shaken by the entire ordeal or experience. So so I think it's not as simple as just we look at that and say, okay, while it's important to look at the legal aspect of it, right? The child here has to transit from one birth family to adoptive family, and then from there figure out what's happening again. And I think any parent who adopts children must think about these things as they proceed on, as life beckons.
Now let's just say this scenario, right? Like a bit of a radical twist. Now, this couple, Ryan and Eva, instead of one male, one female, what if the couple here were both male? You have a Ryan and Jason, for example.
Well, I mean, there was a recent case of a surrogate child born to a homosexual couple. The law still does not allow for adoptions by homosexual couples, but in that case, the adoption was actually allowed for child welfare reasons. It's not entirely clear whether this will still be allowed going forward.
Yeah, so Mun Loon, ever encountered any such situations where you have to speak to couples of the same gender?
Well, I do. And when they want to have children, I think I think the science or the research and an evidence-based practice that guides us as social workers is the literature at this point of time is evolving as well. Interestingly, and from the West, we are seeing a lot more research coming out on the impact of single gender parents on children, and that's juxtaposed against family from male and female families, right? Male parent and female parent families. So heterosexual couples. At this point, personally, I'm not ready to land on an opinion to say, I think it's the same, because the research is also conflicting at this point of time. What we are also seeing is that there are benefits in heterosexual families, as well as and we're also seeing that there is not much of a difference in homosexual couples becoming parents. But I still say, it's social science research. We haven't landed on this yet, and it will take some more time for us to study it some more to see how its impact really is in the long term.
Right. So now we're moving on to the second scenario that we've prepared. Now, this second scenario actually concerns two divorcees, Ben and Amber. Ben has a 14-year-old daughter, Jennifer, whilst Amber has a 17-year-old son, Johnny. Now, Ben and Amber wish to tie the knot, but they're concerned about the implications this may have on their current families and ex-spouses. What issues do you foresee, Mun Loon?
Well, I'll start by giving you the numbers quite jarringly. 1 in 4 marriages end in a divorce. We're looking at a divorce rate thereabouts, right? So we are also looking at more families, more people remarrying. And I must say that when couples tell me they are remarrying, I am happy for them. I mean, it's a happy thing. They found and they're willing to give it a second chance and a second go at it. And I'm generally happy for them. Today, we also see how couples struggle with so the issues that they're faced with, right, would be struggling to break the news to the children. So they will try to introduce the new partner to their children. And most times, children can be quite perceptive. They know what's happening. And children can be, okay, we can accept this. But when the M word, right, when we remarry, the marriage word comes up, right, then suddenly the kids realize that, okay, do I have to choose an alliance between my natural parent or my natural father? And then who's this new man coming into my mom's life? And is he going to replace my dad? So these things do come about. So how do we break the news to the children? And you'd be surprised how children as young as 6 years old will be able to ask these questions. And you'd be quite concerned when they are in their teens, right? They say, oh, whatever makes mommy happy, because that's the right thing that they expected of, it's the mature thing. But to ask them and dig a bit deeper to have those conversations where what are your fears about it would be a bit more challenging when it comes to an older child.
Okay, so typically, what have you encountered? What are the fears for these children?
First, off the bat, right, it's a question of allegiance. How if I get along? And it's a real question. How if I get along with my stepfather? So much so. Is he going to replace my biological dad, Or when the child gets triangulated by the birth parents, right? So the father and mother, and the child feels like he or she has to choose between where allegiance will lie. Especially if this new bloke is such a fantastic guy, can I compare? Is it normal to compare? These are questions that they ask. The next question that they also have, where it pops up, is when a new child in the family comes about. And what's my place? So it's really looking at the family and restructuring it in such a way where they can make sense of all the different changes that's happening at the same time.
Oh, it sounds like it's actually quite challenging for the children, even though they may appear on the surface, oh, it's okay, what's best for daddy and mommy is best for me.
Yeah,
Oh,
so
okay. Yep.
so for children, I think to address these issues is to have clear boundaries, and you involve the child in managing the expectations of each other, of the new role that, say, the stepfather will be playing, the new role that the child will be playing towards the new setup of the family. That would be something that discussion, an open, age-appropriate discussion would be useful.
See. So, Mun Loon, let's say in a scenario, Ben and Amber actually got married, they start living together in Ben's terraced house, but Johnny and Jennifer, the two kids, they just can't get along. Two kids from originally different families. And one day, Ben comes back from work, finds his daughter crying in her room, and then the daughter claims that, well, Johnny, her new stepbrother, had actually slapped her because they fought over who got to use the iPad. What happens in these scenarios, Manu?
And in these scenarios, what will happen will be the parents taking sides, and it does happen. And that's why the conversations, when they start at the start of the relationship, when it gets serious, right, or when they're talking about marriage and getting married again, it's important that these conversations are held then, so that we draw healthy boundaries. And if siblings fight, whether they are blood siblings, whether they are step siblings, or whether they are adopted siblings, siblings will fight. And how do you have the rules to come around trying to make sure that the family continues to function is important. So I don't want to pretend that a happy family, the kids don't fight. All kids will fight in the same household. And how do we manage that depends on how we have set up the rules as early, or the boundaries as early as possible, and how much trust that parents have with their children, and how they repair is important.
I'm just wondering, let's say for Ben, because Johnny is not his son, can Ben actually discipline Johnny because, well, it's not actually his son, it's his stepson?
It's not his son, but his stepson. Can Johnny, I think this is a relationship question between Johnny and Ben. And if Ben and Johnny have a close relationship, right, and it's been fostered over time, where they have a respectful relationship, I don't see what issue there would be if Ben steps up to the plate and says, you know what, Johnny, I think that's wrong. I don't think that's right. I think we should put a stop to it. And that is discipline. Discipline isn't just about taking the child and caning the child in the corner, but it's to set a tone, an example, and to make sure that the kids grow up in a way that they would not be antisocial, it's pro-social. They contribute to the household, to the family, and that's what you want to see in a family. So that role really depends on what Johnny's mother has made of it, and how she has involved her new spouse in the life of, which is Ben, right? In the life of Johnny.
June, is there actually a legal restraint? So, for example, for these blended families, can one spouse tell the other spouse, you can't discipline my child?
Well, I mean, it's not a legal boundary. Actually, what I was going to add into this discussion was that Amber's ex-spouse might have an issue with Ben disciplining Johnny. I mean, I do find this in my divorce work as well, that in these blended families, and then when there's some situation that comes about, it couldn't be, it might be something as simple as fighting over who gets to use the iPad, or it could be as serious as a outrage of modesty situation between Ben and the other daughter, So it could be a serious situation like that, which then, the ex-spouse would then want to take the daughter out of that family and change the care and control and all that kind of thing. So I think that I agree with Mun Loon about the boundaries. Healthy boundaries have to start, about discipline and whether you can get involved with each other's child. Of course, that maybe becomes easier if there were a stepchild adoption, but of course that means that the previous ex-spouses would have to consent to the adoption, and making this a new nuclear family, so to speak. Yeah, so what I would add to this discussion is just really the caution about how this would impact the custody, care, and control of the child with the other ex-spouse.
Yes, yeah, I think that's something that we have not considered. Yeah, how about, yeah, what happens for the ex-spouse? So let's say Ben and Amber, all right, they have formed their new nuclear family. What about the ex-spouses? How are they supposed to get involved now? They're still their children.
They would still have access to the children typically, and so it may be a situation where these children also will be quite conflicted if you think about it. They have to adapt to a new situation in their new blended family, and then also a new situation in their biological father or mother's family, who may have also remarried and who may also have other children. So that's another dynamic that they would have to navigate. I think everybody has to be very careful about these relationships when you enter into them.
Mun Loon, any personal experience, anecdotes from the ex-spouse in that sense?
I remember this case, where the ex-spouse would turn up for Christmas at so the Christmas families gather. So in Australia, families gather over Christmas, right? And it's a long weekend anyway. Usually they close for the whole week. And I remember a situation where the ex-spouse turned up, where there was a family gathering. So his ex-wife remarried and can control the children. So they live with her and they're all teenagers already. But he will purposely turn up on Christmas, right, once a year just to taunt the new spouse.
Oh wow, that's extreme.
And and the ex-spouse is charming as he is, comes, shakes everybody's hand. You hear the complaint, shakes everyone's hand, but he just wants to make his presence felt. And it's not uncommon. You hear that quite a bit. And so we finally got around asking, why do you do that for? He once said, I just wanted to remind that guy, the new husband, that I'm still the father of the children. Like, wow, okay. So I then said, okay, well, sure, I agree with you that you're still the father of the children, no doubt. I don't think your ex-wife has also argued that has changed. Now, the difference here is that you don't have to prove it over Christmas. You don't have to make a point over Christmas. There are other ways to do it, and there are other more meaningful ways. Because when you do this, right, you further isolate your children. Because mom gets into a meltdown, your mom's new spouse, right, gets very grumpy about it, and you're making a spectacle there. And is it really necessary? Who are you trying to spite? And then that got him around and says, okay, I get the point. But it's not uncommon. It's not uncommon that fathers do feel concerned about it.
Is he doing that kind of thing for himself, or is he doing it because of the kids, right? I mean, how would the kids feel about him turning
Yeah,
up?
so exactly. So I asked him, so what do you think the children feel when mom's having a meltdown, when you come by and you swing by, you rock up to the place, and then he says, yeah, but I'll just rock up. Big burly Aussie guy. I'll just rock up. And I said, yeah, but what do you think the children feel? If it matters so much for you that you must exert yourself that day, right? How about your kids? And you pivot that for him, right? Then he thought for it, And then he said, okay, then what else can I do? And then you open up those possibilities for them.
Was there actually a happy, or at least a happier ending to this anecdote of yours?
No, I think what that conversation came around was that the children then told the father and assured him, nothing changed. You remain our dad. Right? And the stepfather makes mom happy, and that's important for us. And that was a conversation teenage children needed to have with their parents. So it's not so simple as let's walk down the aisle again. But to work out the issues with the children will take time, perseverance, and a lot of grit, and a lot of patience on the step parent part, because now you're intruding into a family, right? Or you're intruding into a family. How do you reconcile feeling that way? And there were times the stepfather himself said, I felt rejected by the children. Yeah, nothing I do will please them because there's an allegiance issue going on. So those are very real issues when it comes to step parenting, when it comes to having to play that role in the children's life.
Okay. Really have to think about the children in these scenarios, don't you? Yeah, all right. Okay, let's just throw something else into the mix for this scenario. So after squabbling for 5 years, Amber, the mom here, actually realizes that her own son, Johnny, actually has romantic feelings for her new daughter, Jennifer. And she actually believes that Jennifer feels the same towards her son, Johnny. What should Ben and Amber do now, the parents? Can these two siblings actually be romantically involved?
Well, legally, they are step siblings. They are not related by blood in any way. So there is nothing really legally stopping them from doing this. It's just that I think if they've been raised together, then it just makes life very, very complicated. And I'm sure Mun Loon has plenty to say about that.
Imagine that I'm the grandmother and the grandmother of the same grandchild.
Mhm.
You know, that's what's going to happen, right? Well, yeah, I think in some families it still is taboo that stepchildren are seen as children, and I think that there are families who will say put a firm no to it, and then cause a lot of trouble and a lot of unhappiness. I know of someone who has moved overseas because of this. Something similar, but grew up fostered by a parent, by a family. And then the mother said, I treated you like, how could you do this to me? You know, just what the hell? What did I do wrong? But there are taboos around it. So having to have those conversations will be a bit tougher because family also gives semblance of roles. What role do I play as I grow older? What role do I play as an adult child? What role do I play as a grandparent or mother-in-law or father-in-law? So I look at it and say, all right, this is complicated. It's not going to end their world, but we need to have some of these discussions and talk through them carefully. And how do you, because if I complain about my mother-in-law, who is also my father's wife, wow, that's quite difficult, right? So how does that work, you know? So we need to have those discussions a bit more. Yeah.
All right, so we'll move on to our final scenario of today's webinar. And this is actually a scenario that's probably pretty common. We have an elderly gentleman, all right, Joseph and Betty. Now, Joseph is actually, and he has, Joseph is the elderly gentleman. And he was married previously to this lady called Betty. Now, Joseph is now 65 years old. He has 2 adult children, one Adam and another Zoe, and from his first marriage to Betty, his childhood sweetheart. Now, Joseph now has actually met a 30-year-old lady because unfortunately his childhood sweetheart Betty has passed away. And this 30-year-old lady, Natalie, he's fallen for her. And he's actually just wondering, should he actually marry her? He's 65, she's only 30 years old. What should he do? June, any issues that you foresee?
I mean, in terms of legal issues, I would think in terms of what should happen if this relationship doesn't work out, and what should happen if Joseph passes away. And I mean, in terms of socially, I guess the dynamic that Natalie would have with the 2 adult children. So in terms of, I guess the what should happen upon divorce and all that kind of thing. I mean, Joseph may want to do some kind of financial planning. You know, if spousal maintenance is a thing, or if they want to buy a property in a thing. Because, I mean, in a sense, Joseph, I mean, we were talking about this just before the webinar started. Joseph is not really that old, you know. I mean, at 65, he easily has a good 15, 20 years ahead of him, right? And in that, and while the age gap between him and his second wife may be quite large, they may still go on to buy a property together. They may still live be married for a long, long time together, you know. So there needs to be some kind of financial provision. What is the financial provision? In this particular scenario, of course, the childhood sweetheart Betty has passed away. But if it were a situation where this was, the childhood still had, they were divorced, that the financial planning, there's another implication. I mean, there may have been assets that were split in the divorce, there may have been spousal maintenance that's owed to Betty, and then now that he's entering this new relationship, his financial responsibilities, that they are there with Natalie, and that's something that he has to consider. In terms of estate planning, of course, if he passes away and he marries her, then and if he doesn't do a will, then 50% goes to Natalie, and then 50% to remaining to the two adult children. And if the two adult children, of course, are aware of this, then they may be okay with it, or they may be upset by it. Or if, for example, Joseph does a will and gives 100% of everything that he owns to Natalie and leaving out his adult children because he's estranged from them, for example, that may change the dynamic completely, and then that may make the relationship between adult children and Natalie very, very difficult.
Yeah, Mun Loon, I mean, earlier you did comment, you're very happy for people if they have a second chance of marriage, Would you still have the same opinion for this scenario?
No, absolutely. I would. Well, just last month, actually, I was having a conversation with a friend. She came and asked me, hey, what should we talk about? We're doing a series of talks for elderly people. And I said, one of the things that I would love to have a conversation is to talk about remarriages. Because as we grow older, right, our life expectancy has gone up quite a bit in the last 30, 40 years. And we're looking at becoming 85-year-olds, So Joseph, life expectancy is 85, 86. He's 65. So we should remove the taboo about talking about remarriages, especially when you are widowed. It's not like it's really a circumstance of which you are now looking at remarriage, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I would really want to say, yeah, good for him. I'm glad he met somebody that he can share. What I'd be concerned about really is the dynamics of the relationship, given that they have a rather large age gap. It doesn't mean it won't work. It just means that then how well do they know each other? How well have they gotten into each other's worlds, so that they can relate with each other in a very meaningful way. And that in itself, right, I think will convince their adult children, because they would have to then see how this works for them, that this lady is genuine about it. If simple questions like, what does he like, does not like, and she cannot answer, right, then you should be a bit worried. But if she's genuinely, knowing him well, get to know him better, is interested in his life, wants to know how to make it better for him, then I don't see why we should be shying away from that topic, if at all.
Well, so let's say for the two adult children, they actually do care for Joseph, they care for their father. Adam himself is very worried because he reads articles, he's worried that, oh no, is daddy being conned? Is he old? Is he senile? He's not thinking straight. Is he going to lose all his hard-earned savings after working for over 40 years, whereas, you have Zoe who's more open to this. She thinks that they should just trust their father, just let daddy be happy. What can actually either sibling do, for this scenario?
Well, first, I think it's good to make sure that he has mental capacity to go into marriage. I think that's the important thing. He knows what he's doing. He knows that it is not. It's not a game for him. That he's serious about it. It's important that Joseph and Adam have a good talk about this. Ask Adam what his concerns are. How can we allay those concerns, and involve Natalie in that conversation eventually as well. That would be really useful, because it's really having each other to know each other. You can't trust someone you don't know. And if you have to trust someone, it's a bit blind trust, right? And that trust that you start with, like, for example, even if we don't know each other, right? And if I turn up on time, for example, and you trust that I would, and I have over time, it's the small things that matter. So it would be the small things that Natalie does with Joseph, along with the children, that's important. And Joseph has a role to play to set these things up. You cannot just leave it to her to say, okay, all the best to you. Okay, you have to convince my children. And if they say, okay, then we get married. Then she'll be wondering who she's marrying. But if Joseph also sets it up for her and say, let's do it together, let's make sure that we know what we're doing and our children should trust us with it, and we should show them how we can be trusted, That's important. You cannot just leave it for things to fall into place naturally. It really doesn't happen that way.
June, I think Mun Loon mentioned this thing about mental capacity. June, could you just give us a simple explanation? What exactly is this mental capacity?
Well, whether you lack mental capacity, I mean, that is a medical assessment, that only a doctor can make. But of course, the law presumes that you have mental capacity to sign wills, give instructions for your LPA, your lasting power of attorney, marry and do anything any normal adult can do, unless proven otherwise, right? So, I mean, what with like early onset dementia and things like that coming into play, right? That I can understand why Adam would be worried. He would think that maybe his father is depressed from grief, or something like that, from the demise of his childhood sweetheart, or and is vulnerable at this point in time. But of course, vulnerable does not mean lack mental capacity. And it therefore is important that Adam should have that very important conversation with his father about intentions and get to know Natalie. I completely agree. I mean, I actually, another thing that I wanted to throw into the mix is, Natalie is 30. I mean, that's a good age to be having kids. Is that something that Natalie would want in her future? Is that something that, does she want to adopt children? Does she want to have a biological child? I mean, that's something that could even be thrown in the mix, and that might make the relationship between Adam, Zoe, and that new child very difficult, because I mean, I have dealt with cases like that where then they have one more child, and that means that actually the pot, so to speak, of assets will be divided amongst the legitimate children. So it's no longer 50% to the wife and 25, it's 50%, and then remaining 50 divide 3. And that really might make the whole thing a little bit more complicated.
Mun Loon, any experience where you have a situation where you really have an older gentleman and a younger lady, and then they want to have children?
And then I'll ask the gentleman, yeah, that's not a bad idea. The question is, will you be able to care for the child? Or will you be leaving it? And have you discussed this with Natalie, and has Natalie agreed? And let's assume you have 15 years, right? We look at 80 as a good benchmark. And say that's lifespan. It doesn't, sorry, very rude, but it doesn't mean that you'll be active until then, It could also mean that by your 75, you really slow down. And then you have 10 more years where you're much slower than you were before. Is it fair to leave it, Natalie? Have you discussed this with Natalie? Have you talked this through with Natalie? And how will you take care of the children or the child how do you take care of her? How do you make sure that you provide for the child? Or how do you make sure that the child can be given the same, or if not as good as opportunities as the older two children? These are very real concerns. I'm not saying you should be, it's all about the material as well, but it's also the emotional. It's about the psycho-emotional well-being of the child. Are you going to be there and present for the child? Or will you be an absent father for the child, and the child actually figures out life on its own, because daddy is really quite aged already. So what does that mean for you all? So it's a lot of a meaning question, but at the same time, it's also a reality testing question for him, because it's nice and it's a very ideal situation. Oh yeah, I'm 65 and I have a baby, But what does it really mean for you? What does it entail? I think that's a conversation I would like to have with the couple.
So let's change the perspective a little. Let's think about from Natalie's perspective. This young lady, she actually really loves Joseph. No such concerns that Adam had. She actually wants to spend the rest of her life with him. But Natalie recognizes she has financial debts. She doesn't want to burden Joseph or appear like she's marrying him just for the money. What can Natalie actually do in this situation?
If frankly a civil partnership or boyfriend-girlfriend kind of relationship works for them, then it works for them. I mean, good for them. And if she wants to, then, because of course this concept of family or relationship is different from the legal institution and norm, right? So if Joseph wants to still provide for her, then upon death, then he should just do a will and name her specifically.
Is it an ideal arrangement to just leave it as a just civil partnership, as you say?
I think it's really what Natalie and Joseph want out of each other. You know, if they're just looking for companionship,
Yes.
then okay, maybe it works. If Natalie is this is her first marriage and this first relationship and she's looking to have a child from it, then maybe not. That's not it. She's probably looking at marriage. Or if she's actually prepared to say, okay, I'm going to have a child, I'm fully prepared that I'm going to be a single parent. If it works for us now, it works for us now. But if we break up, the child's mine and I'm going, right? And you're okay with that, then fine, stay just as unwed parents, it's fine.
Yeah, certainly quite a number of serious adult conversations. I think both of you have shared that. Seems like whenever you're talking about this concept of marriage, you really need to talk a lot before actually getting married. Yeah, okay, let's move on to our Q&A segment. I just want to remind our audience that you can actually submit questions to our panelists and anything about marriage, any advice you would actually like to seek from our panelists. So do feel free, please feel free to just send us your questions, and June and Mun Loon will definitely try their best to answer them to the best of their ability.
Let's have a look at the questions.
Let's see here. All right. Okay, just wondering, right? June. June. Earlier we had this discussion about custody, care, and control for children. Can I just understand? So let's say in the event of a divorce, right? What are these principles that the court usually looks to for just custody, care, and control in general?
Okay, so when we deal with child issues, whether they are children of a marriage or they are children born to unwed parents, okay, it's the same thing. We deal with three concepts: custody, care and control, and then access. So custody decisions are important decisions involving the child's life. So for example, religion, you cannot change the child's name without the other party's consent, medical, education, so very, very big things. And typically the court would order joint custody for both married parents as well as unmarried parents. Makes no difference because you are still parents of the child. And then you would deal with, so you typically is joint custody unless can show very exceptional circumstances. So very extreme physical, sexual abuse, really like dangle your child out of the window kind of situations. And then sole custody also can happen if the both of you completely cannot work together. And then let's move on to the second concept, which is care and control. The care and control parent is the parent that the child lives with. The care and control parent makes the day-to-day decisions of the child's life. So, what does the child eat? What time does the child sleep? Kind of monitors the homework. Sometimes people say that the care and control parent has the more onerous responsibility of supervising homework, making sure meals are in, picking up the child from childcare and all that kind of thing. So the more onerous responsibilities fall to the care and control parent. And they may see the access parent almost as the third concept that I was talking about, access, right? The access parent is the other parent who doesn't have care and control. So access parents tend to be seen as the so-called fun parent, right? You only see them maybe for one dinner on a weekday, or you see the child on Saturdays. And you may have overnight access. So access can take many forms. Access could be supervised at a center where counselors may get involved to observe the relationship between and try to regulate the relationship between father and child, for example, if they have not seen each other for a long time. Access can be quite flexible between the parties, and they try and negotiate and see what pockets of time, because you have to recognize that when the family does split up, the child's time is also similarly split up. And you cannot think of it in terms of 50-50 time. That's not the way that the court looks at it. And also, if you look at a child's schedule over a week, it may be quite difficult. You have to put the child first, and the routines and the schedules for them to feel comfortable in this new dynamic. And then after that, you look at what pockets of time you can then see the child. But a lot of people still think of it as like, oh, we break up, I want 50-50. But frankly, the court doesn't look at it that way. And I don't think that the social science way of looking at it should be that way either. Yeah, so access, and then if people cannot be flexible about it, or you want to have some routine about it, then you just fix pockets of time. So if it's Wednesday night, Saturday, you know, and the school holidays or overseas access, that's when people start talking about the different access arrangements.
You know, June, I've heard, from ex-colleagues as well, they've had incidents where divorcees, they fight over the access to the child, and one parent complains of the other parent saying, he's always late to come and pick up my child, and then afterwards he doesn't stick to the specific hours that he's supposed to be with the kid. He tries to drag it on. How do you actually typically resolve these matters?
The legal way of doing things, of course, is you file your committal application, you file your variation applications, but I don't necessarily think that they are particularly useful in dealing with these kinds of things. So I'm going to turn over to Mun Loon to share with us.
Yeah, Mun Loon, how would you fix this? One parent says he's always coming 10 minutes late, and as a result, the parent says, because of this, he should always have 10 minutes less access.
I get this when I do divorce mediation. It comes up all the time. Yes, I think I start on this premise that if the couple could work well together and cooperate and they can sing Kumbaya together all the time, then they're less likely to be getting divorced. So clearly the relationship has broken down, and it's a real issue that they are faced with, and the divorce is an outcome of a relationship that has broken down. So the natural consequence of a broken down relationship is really getting a divorce. So I think it's important that we need to recognize that the people within the new setup after the divorce, right, continue to harbor the same pain that caused the divorce, if not even more. Because there are more misgivings that happens after the divorce or carries on after the divorce as well. Because we don't deal with the root cause of why the marriage had failed in the first place. So I've always championed this, and I'm thankful for a platform to talk about it, that if parties don't get marriage closure or closure to their marriage properly, an emotional closure to the marriage, right, then 10 minutes late, 5 minutes late will always bugger you, will always bother you, because it's a reminder of the other party's inability to keep to his or her word. And that's why the marriage didn't work in the first place. That's what comes up and resurfaces all the time. So having that discussion, actually with a therapist is important. Even if your ex-spouse doesn't want to come for therapy, right, nothing stops you to go and see a social worker or counselor to find closure with that relationship that didn't work out, so that you don't let it eat you up, rather than instead it ends up eating you up. So dealing with that as early as possible actually sees a lot of benefits for the children. Because the children don't become pawns in that fight that unending fight that you'll have with your ex-spouse. And you also end up having to manage ex-spouses popping up over Christmas much better as well.
So you would say that actually, the real solution for these disputes is really sit down, talk, engage, and get proper closure from the original divorce.
Yes, and sometimes, I will acknowledge this upfront, that you can't get both parties to do it. So one party is happy to be cruel, or one party is happy to give you the payback, right? But I've told couples this many times. I said that, what, if he cannot hurt you, right? If whatever he does cannot hurt you, he will stop, because it gets tiring for him or her as well. So having to deal with the manage your own emotions in relation to the other person's behavior is far more important than what the other person really does, and managing that properly.
So we have this question from the audience now. This individual wants to know, okay, and Mun Loon, June, feel free to answer it. What's actually the process for adoption in Singapore? Is there some cost involved? Are there any recognized agencies that actually provide adoption services?
There are a couple of agencies that do. I mean, the more famous ones, Fei Yue and Touch. I think it also depends on adoption, what kind of adoption you're trying to do, you know. So the most common kind of adoption is the stepchild adoption. So blended, they've already married and then blended family and then they adopt each other's children. So if that's the case, the children are in Singapore and it becomes easier. But of course, if you're trying to adopt a child, for example, from China or from Vietnam or one of the other overseas, you know, then that's when you would start to use I would recommend using an adoption agency to deal with some of the immigration issues. So for example, adopting a child from China, there's a whole process involved there. And it's not like you could just bring the child over and then that's it, right? In terms of cost, of course, I will leave that to those agencies involved. The MSF website, actually, there's an MSF website on adoption. It sets out the procedure quite clearly. You start off with a pre-adoption briefing, and it's a workshop which tells you about, you know, what do you have to do, what are your responsibilities as an adoptive parent, how do you break the news of the adoption to the adoptive child, and things like that. Then you go on to do home study report, and then after that you go on to apply for a dependence pass for the child, and then after that, that's when the lawyers come in. That's when we do the actual adoption application in court. And MSF goes on to do their report. So actually the whole process for adoption is really not that fast. Typically nowadays it takes about 9 to 12 months to get through. And in that meantime, you may need, the birth cert is actually submitted to court and to the ICA. So some people find it a little bit difficult because of the time, right? And then not able to travel, not able to apply for new passport and things like that while the adoption is ongoing. So it is something that you do have to commit to. And therefore, I think it is something that you need to be very considerate about.
I think, June, you mentioned lawyers have to be involved. So you have to engage your own lawyer if you want to adopt a child?
You don't have to. I mean, a lot of people do file their own adoption applications in court if you want to. If you don't want to deal with the paperwork and the hassle of having to go to court, then hire a lawyer to do the adoption application.
Mun Loon, there's this question. Maybe you can enlighten the audience. Let's say someone has lost their son of 12 years old last year, and then the couple now, they're actually exploring between fostering and adoption. Is there actually a best recommendation?
Well, I want to say before I carry on giving a straight answer, my condolences to the family that lost a child, 12-year-old child last year. Must have been very difficult, and I hope that as time passes, the memory of the child remains strong, gives you strength, you know, as you move forward. The question of adoption in such a circumstance is it's a very meaningful one. I think the question I want to ask is, rather than we're not looking for a replacement child, right? So that's the first thing that I want to set up, you know. And the conversation must revolve around why do we want to do that? What is it that's driving us to do so? And finding the closure of the relationship with the child as deceased child is important, because the child that comes in cannot be the replacement. So you cannot transfer all your ideals and all your hopes to the new child. And the child will be a different person that will take his own personality or her own personality and grow up with your family. So having to have those discussions between both of you, even with a counselor, is important. So please take the time to grieve, and then going forward, right, have an open discussion of what it means to us. Why do we want to do it? Adoption, personally, I'll be open and share it here in this platform that even I had talked about adopting a child before, and adopting children or fostering children, because at the end of it, right, you're loving a child that isn't biologically yours. And to some and to many, right, it is a higher order of wanting to love somebody that has no blood links with you and treat that person or that child as your own. So it's not a conversation that, you know, we take lightly. And then the next question that you also want to ask is, okay, if I have adopt a child, and it's our own, right, and we have another child that comes along, and because many people also adopt because they can't have children at that time, and over time they have children later, no? So how does it work? what are we going to tell our children? How do we share with them that daddy and mommy loves both of you or three of you just as much, but we just love you differently. So work that through together with your spouse and the community in your kampong that you belong to. Have that conversations with people that know you and love you, and want to be invested in your family life. And then lastly, I would suggest that you speak with a counselor just to process the grief, work that through, and then as you emerge from that, right, then at least you have more resolve in wanting to, in why you're doing so. So I think that's what I would say to the parents. Yeah.
Just something from the audience again. Well, will adopted children, right, have equal inheritance rights with children, biological children, when the parent passes away without a will?
I think we need to draw that distinction again between the singly adopted child and the jointly adopted
I would
child.
say it's jointly adopted child.
Yeah, I mean, jointly adopted child, then yes, legitimate. As long as you are adopted, you have an adoption order, you are a legitimate child. It's as if you were a biological child, so no difference whatsoever. So, for example, I mean, in Mun Loon's example, if you have one adopted child and then subsequently you have another two, then yes, it is your assets divide three lah. That's the way it works. But of course, if it is just the adopted child of your one spouse and then not adopted of the other one, then it's not, and the father passes away, right? That the father only has two biological children, the subsequent two, not the first one. Okay, so then it's of course the whole thing divide two as opposed to divide three. But if the mother passes away, then of course it is divide three because she has three children. Adopt the first one and then the other two.
Would a will help in these situations?
Yes, of course. Like I said from the very beginning, if you want to do anything a little bit special, then just have the appropriate legal instruments to cover that situation.
Okay. Well, we do have a bit of time remaining. Let's see if anyone in the audience has any further questions. Let's just give everybody a bit of time. Just Mun Loon, any interesting tales that you've experienced previously when it comes to speaking to people about adoption?
Well, one of the things that since you asked and I should share this, but I had journeyed with a couple who were contemplating adopting a child for many years. All right, and we sat through and we talked about why they decided. Well, why was it even a conversation at home? What prompted it? Who wanted the adoption? How did the other party feel about it? For me, right, I personally find adoption and fostering very beautiful because you include people into your family that at times will not have a family to care for them, So it's a very meaningful and a very beautiful way of sharing family warmth. So as we walked that through and we talked it through, it was, and I always said that the motivations for adoption has to be clear. I'm not here to say it's right or wrong because we live very different lives, right? But when it's clear for the parties, for husband and wife or the adopting party, right, to understand why and what the motivations are, that's very helpful because going forward, it won't be this is your child and your idea, or this is my child and my idea, but this is something that we jointly decided on, and the circumstances of which led to that decision is important. So don't downplay the emotional discussion behind it or beneath it, because that's important and that will also guide how you raise the child and how you break the news to the child as they grow up, and tell them that they're adopted or not. Yeah.
With Mun Loon's words of wisdom here, I'm afraid, I do have to bring this webinar to a close. I would really like to thank June and Mun Loon for actually sharing your expertise, your stories, your experience with us. For the audience, please scan the QR code or visit the website www.cdc.gov.sg/Law Awareness Weeks to find out more about the other webinars under Law Awareness Weeks at CDC2021. Relationships are precious. Heal the relationships with those around you. After this webinar ends, a feedback form will be shown in your browser for your completion. And we would really appreciate if you could just take a couple of minutes to complete the form so that we can improve our webinars. With that, thank you for joining us today and have a pleasant week ahead.
Thank you.
You.
Have a good evening.